At the Beckett Federal Courthouse, he was just Chuck, the doorman, someone no one bothered to look at. But that night, as the trial for the state's largest corruption case was about to begin, the entire security system collapsed. Locks were distorted, cameras went black, and confidential documents vanished. While judges and lawyers panicked like ants from a broken nest, only one man walked directly into the darkness without hesitation. The old janitor, whom the entire building had mocked for over a decade. Chuck Norris first stepped through the cast-iron gates of the Beckett Federal Courthouse on a gloomy autumn morning, more than 10 years ago. There were no drums, no applause, just the shuffle of worn shoes on cold stone and the creak of an old hinge. His blue-grey uniform had faded, his cap soaked in the sweat of time, and from his waist, a heavy ring of iron keys clinked with each step. In this so-called Temple of Justice, someone like Chuck was simply part of the backdrop, unseen, unnamed, unspoken. Young clerks, legal assistants, office staff, and judicial police passed him every day, most without a glance. If they did look, their eyes held vague indifference, sometimes irritation, as if his presence was a faint smudge on the courthouse's cold white floors. His official title? The head of his bed, ground floor maintenance, door security. A job so plain, no one paid it any mind. But there was one thing none of them knew. Every night after work, when office lights dimmed and the echo of dress shoes vanished from the halls, Chuck Norris began his real shift. Patrolling the courthouse, corner by corner, door by door, locked. His steps were slow, intentional, as if he were reading a silent symphony, where each creak of a hinge, each breeze slipping through a gap, carried hidden meaning. In his shirt pocket was always the same weathered leather notebook. Its cover was scratched, the pages inside yellowed. Any abnormality, from the faintest lock click to the slightest scratch on a camera lens, was recorded with meticulous notes, his handwriting crisp and steady. To those too busy to look deeper, Chuck's life seemed to be that of a failed old man, clinging to odd jobs just to get by. But the truth was far more complex. Before arriving at Beckett, Chuck Norris had once been a name of weight in very different corridors, ones not meant for public light. He had been the head of internal security at the U.S. Department of Justice, the architect of internal defense systems for the country's most critical courts. Back then, his hair was jet black, his eyes sharp as blades, and every step he took made even the youngest security staff stand straighter, purely on reflex. Then, one day, when the powerful needed a scapegoat to cover up a security scandal, Chuck was chosen. He refused to be a false witness. He refused to bend the rules to protect powerful names. And so, overnight, he was forced into retirement. Silently, his files sealed with ambiguity that no one bothered to investigate. Chuck didn't complain. He didn't sue. He simply walked away from the artificial lights of justice, as if it was something he had long prepared for. At Beckett, Chuck chose to be the doorman. A job no one admired, but also one no one cared enough to make difficult. Each morning at 5 a.m., Chuck arrives, checking every entrance, sweeping the main hallways, and polishing brass nameplates that had long tarnished. He always finished before the offices opened, so the busy people wouldn't see any trace of him. The keys on his belt were more than physical tools. They were symbols of meticulous habit, absolute patience, and most of all, the will to protect justice in his own silent way. The young people in the courthouse sometimes mocked him behind his back. Bet he thinks he's in an action movie. Who would even break into this place? Old folks and their delusions. Maybe he thinks this is the White House. Chuck never responded. Not a frown, not a word. He simply chuckled under his breath, a sound no one heard, and went back to his duties, slow and steady, step by step. Once, a young legal assistant, Lind, accidentally dropped a confidential file near the side gate. When she frantically returned to find it, Chuck was already standing there, hands in his pockets, waiting silently. As she approached, he simply handed her the folder and said in a quiet, even tone, in this place, what falls to the ground can matter more than what's left on the table." Flushed with embarrassment, Linda thanked him and quickly returned to her routine, soon forgetting the moment amid the courthouse's daily rush. But Chuck didn't forget. He quietly recorded the time, location, and every small detail of the incident. Not to judge, but because he understood one thing. Even the tiniest crack can open the door to disaster if no one's paying attention. For 10 years, Chuck Norris continued that way. Rainy days, snowy days, days when the courthouse was filled with noisy hearings, or silent days when only the wind whistled through the hallway gaps. He still made his rounds, still wiped down the doorknobs, still checked the fire alarms, the cameras, and the emergency exits. No one asked him to. His job description only required him to clean the ground floor. But for Chuck, dedication didn't come from orders. It came from instinct. It came from a silent oath he had once sworn to himself, long ago. Chuck Norris's eyes weren't just the eyes of an old man. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Empty promises, justice sold out, courtrooms where truth was gift-wrapped in fancy language. So when that night arrived, the fateful night, darkness swallowed the Beckett courthouse. When the lights went out, when the electronic locks were disabled, when unfamiliar footsteps echoed in the halls, there was only one person who had been preparing for this moment for a very, very long time. Chuck Norris. He unclipped the keyring from his belt. She let go as she saw the tears trickle and reached for the hidden door leading down to the old maintenance basement, a forgotten passage known only to the original architects of the courthouse. His steps were deliberate. His gaze was sharp as a blade. And tucked inside the sleeve of his worn-out jacket was the same weathered leather notebook, the living proof of a man who chose to protect justice, even when justice forgot him. That night, the sky over Beckett swallowed every last bit of light. Dark clouds thickened overhead, masking moon and stars alike. Wind howled through the empty streets, rushing past barren trees, its whistle cold and hollow, like the dying breath of an aging city. The Beckett courthouse, with its towering white pillars, stood like a powerless witness to history, too familiar with the quiet wars waged behind its heavy oak doors. But tonight, a different war ignited in silence. Around 2 a.m., Chuck Norris had just completed his final inspection round. He quietly wiped up a patch of water near the rear exit, straightened the entrance mat no one had cared to fix all day. A small habit, but to Chuck, every detail mattered. Just as he was about to pour himself a cup of black coffee from his old thermos, something odd occurred. The hallway camera on the ground floor flickered. Not a full blackout, just a sharp, sudden blink. It was as if someone had cut and spliced the power for a brief moment. Chuck narrowed his eyes. His hand instinctively tightened around the thermos handle. For those who'd worked in security, instinct moved faster than thought. He said nothing, made no noise, and headed toward the small tech room tucked behind the grand staircase. The central panel controls the courthouse's internal camera and lock system. And there, he saw what no one else was supposed to. Every status light on the control board was flashing red, signaling external interference. One camera, right at rear exit number 3, was showing a total signal loss. Chuck didn't panic. He silently closed the control room door, locking it with a mechanical key. A piece of technology even the best hackers couldn't override. In the dim light, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. On it was a hand-sketched map of the courthouse's oldest escape routes, forgotten maintenance tunnels and basement access ways. Only the original designers ever knew they existed. The camera blackout matched the entry point to the evidence storage wing. On the third floor, evidence room 3, the archive holding the original files for the Vermont Vers Global Chem case. That was the target. If handled properly, the case could expose a deeply rooted network of corruption spanning politics and finance. But if the files were stolen or tampered with, the justice system of the entire state could collapse. Chuck understood that. He didn't need anyone to say it out loud. He tightened his grip on the keyring and slipped quietly into the dark hallway. Hackers or mercenaries were already somewhere inside. They weren't loud. They didn't force doors. They left no careless trace. They were professionals, highly trained. And that was precisely why Chuck had to act now, because he knew, with people like this, a few minutes of delay could turn the whole courthouse into a smoldering relic of history. Chuck headed toward the rear access corridor, his hand never leaving the strap of his keyring, the only potential weapon he carried. His footsteps were soft, calculated, like an old cat that had prowled danger for decades. Suddenly, from somewhere up ahead, a faint sound. Not footsteps, no more than voices, but a soft, precise clicking, the sound of a lock-pick device at work. Chuck rose, tilted his head. Outside, the wind roared through a cracked window, but he could still separate each click of the device. His instincts were tuned into danger like a radio to a hidden frequency. And then he saw it. Across the hallway, nestled in the shadow of a far wall, a compact electronic hacking device had been plugged into the lock of evidence room 3. Next to it, 2 silhouettes lurked in the dark. Dressed entirely in black, faces covered. Their movements were smooth and synchronized. Professionals. Chuck didn't rush in. He knew he wouldn't win a direct confrontation. He was no longer the younger man with spring-leaded legs and iron reflexes. But he had something they didn't. He had time. He had memory. And he had secret paths no one else knew existed. Quietly, step by step, Chuck backed away. He turned right, then left, ducking into a side corridor and slipping through a rusted door that led into the basement. The door groaned faintly. To Chuck, it was as loud as an alarm. He paused, tightened his grip on the handle, breathed slowly, counted beats. Only when he was certain no one had noticed did he slip inside. The Beckett basement wasn't like modern facilities. It was a maze of narrow hallways, crooked stairs, and old storage rooms, some dating back to the 1930 set. The pale beam of his flashlight swept across yellowed walls. Dust, cobwebs, the thick scent of mold. None of it slowed him. His hand brushed the wall as he walked, counting bricks and cracks. Each one is a landmark in a mental map only he and the original builders would recognize. He stopped at a heavy rusted steel door. Under the flashlight's glow, a faint engraving appeared. A shield and a hawk, an old emblem of the Department of Justice. Chuck exhaled slowly. It was time. He inserted the smallest key on his ring, seemingly ordinary, except for a tiny triangle etched into its edge. The door creaked open, releasing a cold breath from the long-abandoned passage, like a ghost from the past, embracing him one more time. Inside was a narrow corridor, just wide enough for one man, leading directly to evidence room 3, where the intruders were already at work. Chuck stepped in, closed the door behind him, then peeled a small roll of tape from his pocket and sealed the lock from the inside. He knew, once he went in, there would be no quick exit. But he also knew this was the only guaranteed path to stop them before it was too late. Footsteps echoed faintly from above. A door burst open. The disabled alarm system emitted faint, staggered beeps, powerless cries from a severed nervous system. Chuck moved like a shadow. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to match the musty rhythm of the underground air. His flashlight flickered across broken stone steps, rusted pipes, and cracked iron railings. When he reached the third junction, he stopped. He listened. Voices. Barely whispers. It is not full English, just short-clipped commands that are as sharp as knives. The kind used by people trained to operate in the dark. Chuck pressed his lips together. He'd heard that kind of tone before. Not from ordinary soldiers, but from elite mercenaries. From his pant leg he drew a small item. A mini convex mirror, the kind old-school security agents always carried. He slipped it under the corner of the wall, tilted it slightly. There they were. Two men in black, masked, using handheld devices to extract data from the evidence room's main server. A third stood guard in the hallway, holding a stun gun, non-lethal, but enough to incapacitate someone in seconds. Chuck lowered the mirror. His hands moved fast, muscle memory from another life. He unhooked a thin steel clip from his keyring. Paper clip? No. It was a modified short-range radio signal scrambler, one he'd built himself. If tuned to the right frequency, it could jam internal comms within a 20-meter radius. Enough to sow confusion without triggering a full-blown alarm. He slid the device into a crack in the wall. Slipped the switch. A tiny click. Almost instantly, the guard twitched. He tapped his earpiece. Nothing. He gestured to the others. Urgent, confused. That flicker of hesitation, that was Chuck's moment. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small rubber ball. Once a child's toy, now repurposed. He tossed it gently toward the opposite wall. The echo bounced sharply, drawing the guard's attention. The man turned toward the sound, grip tightening on the stun gun, stepping forward, back now exposed. Chuck struck. No noise. No flare. Just a swift swing of his heavy keyring, smashing directly into the man's wrist. The guard groaned. The stun gun clattered across the floor. Chuck didn't stay. This wasn't about knocking them out. He only needed time. Chaos. The man collapsed, groaning. The other two spun around, pulling sidearms. But Chuck had already melted back into the shadows. Gone, like smoke into a storm. The silent battle had begun. Chuck hadn't triggered the digital alarms. He didn't need to. Instead, he'd relied on something far older. Something no one even knew still worked. Over the past decade, bit by bit, night by night, he had secretly restored the courthouse's original mechanical alert system. Thin steel wires hidden beneath peeling paint, snaking behind vents, and through floorboards, leading directly to a small, forgotten signal board in the night guard station. And now, with the intruders moving into the evidence room, that system came alive. The bell rang. Not throughout the building. Just one quiet, deliberate clang behind the guard's desk. Enough for the trained few to understand. Internal breach. The intruders felt it. They scrambled, rushed, gathering gear, cutting feeds, whispering to each other in sharp, clipped tones. But they were too late. Backup power flickered on. Emergency lights, dim, blood red, began to pulse faintly across the courthouse halls. Chuck stood still in one of them, his silhouette painted crimson against the wall's chipped plaster. He didn't breathe heavily. He didn't rush. He had memorized the rhythm of these halls decades ago. The speed of a breach. The timing of a response. Behind him, hurried footsteps echoed. The mercenaries had realized they weren't alone. Not security. Not police. Something else. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man who moved like an ex-military commander, halted at the end of the hallway. His eyes, sharp and suspicious, scanned the shadows. He raised 2 fingers. His team split off, scanning every door, every alcove. Nothing. No trace. Just a hallway full of locked doors and old shadows. And one of them kicked open a service door. Suddenly, snap. A line of steel cords, nearly invisible in the dark, snapped tight and triggered an old pulley system Chuck had installed years ago, just in case. A rusted mechanical arm swung shut, slamming the door backward into the intruder's face. The man crumpled. His weapon skittered across the floor. Panic broke out. The leader growled, "Fall back." They finally understood. This wasn't just a janitor. This was someone who knew the building better than any of them. Every sticking door, every vulnerable lock, every loose tile. This was his house. Chuck Norris stepped out from the shadows. Deliberate, unhurried. His calloused hands still gripped the ring of keys, now dark with oil, worn with time. His face, weathered and lined, radiated an unspoken gravity. The red emergency lights cast deep shadows on his cheekbones, tracing every scar, every crease. But his eyes were ice. Not angry, afraid, just sharp. Like the man had never stopped watching, never stopped remembering. Mercenary leader saw him. Hugh lifted his stun gun. A voice gritted and confused. "Who the hell are you? Security? Some retired cop?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. Didn't blink. He didn't answer. That silence wasn't fear. It was disdain. The kind that only men who've outlasted systems and buried secrets can wield. The man sneered. Pulled the trigger. Twin arcs of blue current ripped through the air. But Chuck was already. A silent pivot, a sudden drop, moving not with the reflexes of youth, but with the precision of experience. The electric darts zipped past his shoulder. He volved forward. A blow of motion, and as he rose, the keyring in his hand swung like a pendulum. Trapped. Right into the leader's wrist. A dull snap. A shout of pain. The stun gun flew from his grip, skidding across the floor. Not bad. For a 72-year-old janitor. Now the mercenaries were truly afraid. They didn't understand. How could this old man, this supposed cleaner, move like a phantom? Strike with such precision? They had underestimated him. Fatally. And at that very moment, from the far end of the hall, a new sound arose. The true internal alarm. Louder. Relentless. Flashlights swept the walls. Boots hit the floor. The night security team had arrived, responding not to tech, but to the ancient signal Chuck had reactivated years ago. Panic exploded. The intruders fled, sprinting toward the back exit, the one they'd left open as their escape route. But when they reached it, they found it locked. It a manual deadbolt? The kind of lock you couldn't override. The kind that only Chuck Norris had the key to. Mercenaries turned, trapped, cornered, and saw the guards closing in. They dropped their weapons, raised their hands. Not a single shot fired. Not a drop of blood spilled. Only silence and shame. The Beckett Courthouse was safe. And the man who saved it? Not a high-ranking officer. Not a decorated prosecutor. Just the janitor. Just the man they had laughed at, overlooked, and forgotten. Morning broke over the Beckett Federal Courthouse. Inside the main conference room, every staff member was summoned. Jugglers, prosecutors, legal assistants, senior security officers. They sat in heavy silence, the air tense, thick with uncertainty and shame. The new director of security, a confident middle-aged man, stepped up to the podium. In his hands, a thick dossier stamped "Top Secret." He opened it slowly. He cleared his throat. Then read aloud. Charles D. Norris, born 1952. Former Chief of Internal Security, U.S. Department of Justice. Lead architect of 7 federal defense systems. Recipient of the Attorney General's Medal of Honor, 1996. The room froze. Faces that once smirked behind Chuck's back now drained of color. Whispers erupted like an anxious storm. No way. The janitor? Was a legend? The security director looked around, his voice firm. If Mr. Norris had not been here last night, the global chem evidence would have been destroyed. With that, Mr. Norris, this courthouse, and possibly our entire state system, would be facing a historic breach of trust. He closed the file. Ed stared directly at the crowd. We made a mistake. A serious mistake. Chuck wasn't there to hear it. He stood, as always, on the ground floor, aside the courthouse's great wooden doors. A battered coffee thermos in one hand, his old ring of keys was on the other, as if it were just another day. Because of Chuck it was. He didn't need applause, or didn't want medals. Justice didn't need a spotlight. It just needed someone to guard it quietly. And in the small corner of the lobby a new brass plaque had been installed, without fanfare. Charles D. Norris, the silent watchman. Beckett Courthouse. After that night, the Beckett Courthouse was never the same. Not because of Titus, not because of new glass panels or brighter hallway lights, but because the eyes had changed. The eyes of those who once passed Chuck without a nod. The eyes that used to roll behind his back with muttered jokes like, "What's the old janitor scribbling in that notebook again?" They no longer saw him as background noise. They saw him for what he truly was, a pillow in silence. 2 mornings after the attempted breach, Chuck still arrived early. On time. Still carried his same old coffee cup. Still walked with the keys jangling softly at his side. But something was different. Linda, the same assistant who had once dropped a file near the side gate, stood in the lobby. She saw Chuck approaching from afar, and this time, she didn't walk past. She waited. "Good morning, Mr. Norris," she said gently. Chuck paused, not out of surprise, but as if hearing a sound that had long vanished. He tipped his cap in reply, silent as always. At the small cafe near the courthouse, people now spoke of Chuck, but not with snide remarks, or with hushed reverence. Knew every access point, even that steel-locked hatch beneath the basement we all forgot existed. They say he wrote security protocols for 7 federal courthouses. That's never told anyone, never bragged. Judge Berkeley, known for being stern and detached, passed Chuck in the hallway one day. He stopped, pulled a sealed envelope from his coat pocket, offered it discreetly. "We're nominating you for a formal honor." Chuck glanced at it. "I don't need it," he said softly. The judge nodded. "I know, but we need to give it." That day, Linda came in early again. She knocked gently on the maintenance room door, the one Chuck always sat in after his night rounds. No response. She opened it. The room was clean and neat, as if untouched. Everything was in place, except for one thing. On the table sat a worn leather notebook, the same one Chuck always carried, and beneath it, a small folded paper with one message, typed, bold, simple. Justice is not a result. It is a daily act of quiet persistence, by those never mentioned. No signature, no farewell. Linda opened the notebook. The first page held a hand-drawn map of the courthouse. Every blind spot, every loose lock, every crack in the ceiling. The next, light bulb replacement logs. Names of staff who forgot to lock doors. Careful observations. Then the notes began. Lydia dropped classified file again. The face showed panic. Needs support, not scolding. Office 4. Lock becoming unreliable. Do not alert unless necessary. Nightly door noise in sub-basement 3. Monitor more closely. Line after line. Not surveillance. Oh, good preacher. A month later, a new cohort of young staff arrived at Beckett. Their orientation didn't start in a classroom. It started in a dusty hallway in the basement. With an old wooden chair beneath a modest brass plaque. The silent watchman. Linda stood in front of them. From today, you'll learn to observe as he did. No case should slip by. No flaw ignored. No one dismissed just because they choose silence. A hand was raised. Who was he? Linda smiled softly. He opened the notebook kept under the glass. It was the doorman and the keeper of truth. Epilogue. Where justice sleeps. Far from Beckett, in a quiet countryside town, an elderly man in a faded cap sat on a porch, flipping through a tattered book. Children passed by on their way to school, waving. Some paused. He nodded with a quiet smile. No one knew he once saved a legal system from collapse. They only knew him as Mr. Charles, the quiet one, the man who shoveled snow from the paths first each winter, who fixed the crooked street sign after the storms, who gently stood up a fallen bicycle without being asked. One day, a neighborhood boy asked, "Why don't you ever tell stories about your past? Did you work in the city?" Chuck looked toward the horizon, the sunset lighting his lined face. "Some stories," he said slowly, "are meant to be told by how you live." Final lesson. Not everyone needs to be known. Not all justice is loud. Sometimes, justice is an old man with a notebook. A man checking locks every night. A man who chooses silence. But never let go of what's right. Perfect for fans of real-life twist stories, justice tales, and storytelling that moves the heart. If this touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.